One of the first steps in implementing the UNGPs on business and human rights is to develop a human rights policy. But some organizations struggle with this. In this video, let's talk about developing a human rights policy, how to get started, how to actually design it and decide what it should contain in terms of content, and how to effectively roll it out. We've also included a bunch of really useful links for you in the description box for you to check out after the video. And if you find this video useful, don't forget to give us a thumbs up, which will help others to find it. And hit the subscribe button so that you'll be the first to know when we post other sustainability tips and insights. As we've covered in our other video on human rights due diligence, one of the first steps in implementing an effective human rights program is to set out a human rights policy or commitment. While there's no uniform or set standard of what form this policy should take, it should result in a publicly communicated statement that's been adopted by the highest governing authority of the company, and which commits the organization to respecting international human rights. And while this may seem pretty simple to do, slap a couple of sentences together essentially saying our organization respects human rights, the process involved that underpins these outputs should be a little bit more thought out and deliberative. So how do you get started? As with many business processes, there are a number of key steps you should probably go through in developing your human rights policy. But this needn't be a sequential approach. Nonetheless, a good place to start is probably in assigning senior management responsibility to drive or oversee this process. Now, this doesn't mean that the initiative needs to come from the top down. There have been a number of organizations where the push to adopt a human rights policy was driven initially from a concern communicated from the bottom up. But ultimately, if the organization is going to commit to adopting a policy, it needs to have buy-in from senior management who can set the tone from the top and ensure that necessary resources are made available both to develop the policy and perhaps more importantly, to ensure that the commitments can be carried out consistently once the policy has been developed. Another key step is to take a holistic approach and involve all parts of the organization to participate in the policy development process. So while it's important to assign senior management responsibility for the policy, it's equally important to involve cross-functional elements of the organization to participate in the process. This means the involvement of people from right across the organization. Typically, this may include people from the CSR team who can bring expertise on human rights and understanding the company's broader sustainability commitments. People from operations who can help assess the relevancy of the policy and identify practical elements for its implementation. Human resources to consider the policy's implications for the organization's own workforce. Legal and compliance, of course, to review the policy in light of the company's legal obligations. You might consider internal audit to consider how the organization will verify policy compliance. Procurement to consider implications within the organization's supply chain. Government and investor relations to ensure that demands of certain key stakeholders are taken into consideration. And of course, communications to help ensure that the policy is translated into a language that is understood within the organization and supports existing external communication once it's published. Now, while it may be tempting to simply assign this policy development task to someone in the legal department and let them develop this in isolation, this should really be avoided, as this often short-circuits a rather critical part of the policy development process in helping to build a more holistic understanding of the organization, recognizing and drawing upon the internal expertise and building a sense of common purpose across the organization with respect to human rights. Once the dream team has been assembled, you'll want to set the terms of reference and of the committee and what you're trying to achieve and get some common agreement of basic definitions of human rights. This may involve some workshopping, simple research, and reading some key documents such as the International Bill of Human Rights, among other documents. Once this is set out, you'll want to map out your existing policies so you can identify areas where you already cover human rights and any immediate gaps that exist. At the same time, you'll want to consider mapping out where the company and/or its related activities may have any potential impacts related to human rights. And this is an area where it's useful not only to consider the impacts of the company, but to reverse this and also think about the potential impacts from a rights holder's perspective, or from the perspective of someone whose rights might be affected. This perspective is not always immediately apparent, and some activities may have a knock-on effect, which can indeed have an impact on certain human rights. For instance, on one project I was involved with in Africa, the construction of a mine site resulted in a significant influx of temporary workers. This rapid increase in the local population, however, put a large strain on the existing economy, and prices for fish and for other staples in that community experienced a rapid inflation, affecting the economic situation and livelihoods of local peoples. Clearly an unintended consequence of development, but one which affected the social and economic rights of locals nonetheless. This is why it's important for organizations to also access expertise in human rights, as well as consulting both internal and externally with stakeholders to understand their perspectives and ensure that the policy you're designing responds to their expectations vis-a-vis human rights. Once you've completed the planning stage and are ready finally to put pen to paper, you're going to want to ensure that your policy statement contains at minimum some of the following components. An explicit commitment to respect all internationally recognized human rights and standards, understood to be as a minimum the International Bill of Rights and the ILO's Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Another thing you'll consider is the stipulations concerning the company's expectations of personnel, business partners, and other relevant parties, and information on how the company will implement its commitment in this regard. It can also contain a description of the steps taken to develop the policy, especially if it involves significant stakeholder engagement. It may also include information on what the company perceives to be its key human rights priority areas, a description of how the company will deal with conflicts between international human rights principles on one hand and applicable host government legal requirements on the other, when there's conflict between those two. A commitment by the company to support or contribute to a positive realization of human rights. For example, how will it support human rights defenders? In developing your policy, your organization may also wish to consider the concept of competing human rights. As people better understand their rights and wish to exercise them, some of these rights may come into conflict with the rights of others. In general, competing human rights involve situations where parties to a dispute claim that the enjoyment of an individual or group's human rights and freedoms would start to interfere with another's rights and freedoms. This can complicate the normal approach to resolving a human rights dispute where only one side claims a human rights violation. For instance, let's say that one of your employees is visually impaired and requires a guide dog to assist them in the workplace. This is a situation that may be easily resolved. But what happens if a coworker has quite a hostile allergic reaction to dogs? So some policies set out in a framework to help resolve such situations as these. And we'll include a link in the description box where you can find such a framework. As the policy starts to take shape at a high level, it's also important to pause at this point and have them reflect on what this policy means at an operational level within the organization and ensure that the policy is supported by other internal policies and procedures. And finally, once the policy has been adopted, either formally by the board or by senior management, it needs to be communicated, both internally and externally, so that workers and other stakeholders can understand it and determine what, if any, implications it has for them in their work and in their relationships with other stakeholders and business partners. Now, following these steps, though not necessarily in any particular order that we've presented here, should go a long way in helping your organization to develop a robust and comprehensive human rights policy as part of its efforts to effectively implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights.